Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Zenon Kaplan, and welcome to Envisioning the Future of the Workplace in Asia's Financial Industry, a webinar from Capron Asia in partnership with Getronics. The pandemic forced financial institutions across the region to rethink the work environment as millions of staff across the region were confined to work from home. For many staff, this was a benefit as it shortened commutes and often improved productivity. For others, it was more challenging as it meant juggling personal and professional commitments. As we move back to a new normal, for many institutions, hybrid has become the new normal, catering to those who would both prefer to work from home and those who are happy to come back from the office. Financial institutions, for their part, once again need to think about how they structure their workplace to be able to cater to an increasingly fickle and demanding workforce in a very tight job market. Banks need to be able to cater to both individuals who would rather work from home or those who would rather come back to the office, while at the same time keeping on top of security and compliance requirements. To accomplish this, technology is critical. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, we're going to be taking a look at some of these points in a little bit more detail. We have a great panel lined up for today with representatives from RHB, Getronics, and Barclays. But before we get started, a couple of points of admin. This webinar is being run in listen-only mode. However, we are using the Q&A functionality of Zoom. So if you do have questions for any of the participants, please do engage. We'd love to hear from you and hear some of your thoughts, as well as questions that you have about how other financial institutions are approaching this. So let's get started. I want to start off with Felix Green. Felix is the MD of Treasury for Barclays and based here in Singapore. Felix, why don't you give a brief intro on yourself, and then if you can talk a little bit about where we are today. I mean, how would you define the workplace today, and what have you seen in terms of the needs and expectations of the workforce?
Look, Zenon and Capron Asia and Getronics, thank you for the invite today. Great to be here and great to see you all on the webinar. My name's Felix Green. I run the bank treasury at Barclays here in Asia. So Asia's a global retail investment bank. We have presence across this region, across 6 or 7 countries, and I run the bank treasury in that division. So that's both a kind of front and a middle office department. So I have a broad spectrum of employees from traders to service individuals. So great question to start us off, and thank you for that. So what does the workplace look like today for us? Look, the workplace has changed dramatically since the heady days of kind of the end of 2019 pre-pandemic. As I say, I run the trading desk in a bank, and that's the ultimate kind of classic office model, right? You sit at a desk, head down, trade all day, lunch at the desk, kind of leave, right? So when the pandemic came, it was an enormous shock for us, right? We were, kind of behind the ball in terms of technology on a mobile basis. Our people were very, very used to that kind of classic office model. But the debate, around hybrid working had already started. But it was really the pandemic that kind of forced the execution. I would say, look, we adapted, and we adapted quickly. Needs must, right? When the office is shut, we've got to change. And we adapted not only quickly, but I would say in a permanent manner. Whether that be fully working from home, a hybrid structure of both, fully working from the office, later on. But for a lot of our roles, the workplace became a kind of anywhere space. So, that's kind of where we are now. Obviously 2 and some years later, the workplace looks quite different, and that adaptability will kind of remain. You ask about the kind of needs and expectations of the people that work in organizations. I think that's the right question, right? So, there's certainly the workplace has changed, but how do the people and us meeting their needs and expectations change with it? So, I certainly think the pandemic has given the employer and the employee a large amount of flexibility around the workplace experience, right? Probably something that didn't exist beforehand. you could say the employee has a little bit more power, demander of good technology, expects flexibility, and all of that is kind of great and overdue. So I do think the model, between employer and employee is changing. I'm seeing some people thrive under the new model. I'm seeing some people struggle under the new model. So the model needs to keep adjusting to their needs. Things like overwork due to a kind of blurring between the office space and the home space. Poor performers kind of using the model to kind of hide, whereas overperformers may be blurred between the over communicators that thrive in a model versus excellent individuals who are a bit more quiet that do not. So I do think it's going to require a lot more ongoing thought about how we continue to adapt the model as we go forward.
Those are all really good points, Felix. Just to follow up on that, the trite answer to this is that it's very divided by age, and I've got gray hair and you've got gray hair, so I mean we've gone through quite a bit.
Exactly.
Is that really playing out? Have you seen that at Barclays? Differences between kind of the millennials and the older generation?
I think it's a great question. I think it's more complex than that. I think you've got to add in the type of personality alongside the age. Certainly, the millennial population, of which I have a lot in my team, they are more adapted to this style of working, right, where they have that flexibility. Whereas the grey hairs in the room are still okay with going and sitting at a desk all day. So I do think there's an age play, but I also think there's a personality play where whether the person be a kind of classic type A that works in a banking environment, what we've seen in pretty raw form over the years, versus the quieter individuals, the more complex individuals. I think that has to be considered as much as the age element.
Yeah, those are really good points. I think back to the start of my career, and it was actually so important to be in the office because that's the water cooler conversations and the
exactly
management was very important. Rohan, I want to come to you. I mean, first of all, Rohan, thanks for joining us. Rohan is the Group Technology Advisor at RHB Banking Group. Maybe you can spend a couple seconds kind of introducing yourself. And then, Felix talked about kind of the practical day-to-day. I'm really curious to hear your input kind of on the technology side of things. Can you talk a little bit about the needs around technology and how those have changed over this kind of new era in hybrid work?
Sure, Zenon, thanks. And thank you for having me on this webinar, including Getronics. I'm really happy to be here, and I think it's a really good topic for today. So my name is Rohan Krishnalingam. I'm currently the Group Technology Advisor at RHB Banking Group. I was previously the Group's Chief Operations Officer and also the Group Chief Digital and Technology Officer. RHB Banking Group is the fourth largest banking group in Malaysia, and we have presence in 8 countries in ASEAN. We've got about 14,000 staff, and we basically provide full universal banking services, including banking, Islamic banking, investment banking, insurance, and asset management. Coming to your questions, Zenon, I think I was the Group C DTO during the pandemic. I remember it very.
It's like Rohan froze up. Mukul, are you still with us?
I am with you. Yeah,
Great.
I think we sort of had a technical glitch with Rohan.
The irony of Rohan being the technology advisor and having the technology issues. I'm just happy it wasn't me in this case. Mukul, let me come to you. I mean, you have a broad view beyond obviously just RHB and Barclays. I mean, what are the things that you're noticing from clients, and maybe you can talk to any differences between Getronics financial services clients in Asia versus other markets as well.
No, that's a very interesting topic, and I'm glad that we had a chance to speak about it today. But I mean, I'm just fortunate that you sort of get that wider view because you tend to talk to multiple banking customers and different market, and for that matter, Singapore and Malaysia are very different in this particular context, and then so is the European ones. I think the key and the common, if I just draw some commonality first before we talk about the differences, but I think the key, and I think I'll build on what Felix said, right? I mean, there were parts in the bank, generally banks have managed it well. So, I mean, I think, and again, I happen to be in the position where I see various sector apart from bank, but I think banking sector has managed pandemic fairly well as compared to if I look at other sectors. Now, why I say that, banks were always into the digitalization process. Now, there were parts of the bank that probably were little behind the curve than the forward, and then this pandemic sort of normalized that. I think Felix mentioned some of that from the treasury perspective, and I'm assuming treasury is one area where the control systems are a lot more greater than the other parts of the bank, and he touched upon that. But I think it also started, the banks, and it's interesting, you see, it's about the people, that what sort of skills you're looking in the people and who are thriving versus who are struggling. And some common things came out, like, the people with a very strong communication and collaboration skills enjoyed this journey because they had opportunity to learn, right? And I think from a bank's perspective, the challenge and the opportunity translated into how do you really increase the focus on sustainability, but also on the risk management aspect of it. Because now, just take an example of drawing again, what Felix was saying is, you're not prepared, but you got to do what you got to do. And we went to an extreme curve before we are now coming to an equilibrium. But when you went through that extreme curve where there is no way of coming to that office and you got to figure out the next day the work, right? And we all did, and everybody did. And now looking back, the requirements are changing. Now we're talking about, hey, we are missing on collaborations. We are missing on team culture. We are having this mental issues because we feel too alone in what we are doing. And it's basically, the people to people connection and bonding, and you need to bring everything together from facilities to technologies to bring it together. So, those are, and we'll talk about topics, but, rethinking the office spaces has been there. Especially in Singapore, if you look at it, banks are going through this major transformation. The spaces were shrinking anyways for a long time. Pandemic speeded up. But also the new spaces are very different than what traditionally you have seen in the bank. And I'm very keen to hear from, again, Felix, if they have seen these changes. And flexibility in the working, whatever mechanism you select, but the point is, it is a lot more flexible, and it will continue to be a lot more flexible than it was in the past, in terms of choices to the employees, in terms of banks accepting that choices that has to be given as a part of it. So these are some common conversation, Zenon, which I see it across the industry, but in generally, as I said, I think banks have managed this transition far better than if you look at various other sectors. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some comparisons around that as well. Felix, I just want to come to you on following up on Mukul's point there. I mean, I think, when we first came into the pandemic, this shift to the hybrid model and working from home, for many people, we've seen as a cost. It's a cost of doing business. In certain cases, it made it more expensive. In certain cases, as companies were able to downsize, it might have been cheaper. What about the revenue side of things here? I mean, does this hybrid environment open up new opportunities to drive revenue or new lines of business from this, or is it purely a cost conversation?
No, I mean, it's a great question, right? So, I mean, as you say, the focus was on cost, right? So obviously the financial industry is very centered around providing services that sit in the middle to provide financial services to greater market, right? And they're very angled at making money, right? So what we saw was, aside, the initial response was keeping keeping the doors open, keeping the industry running and humming. Then there was obviously the opportunity that came with cost reduction, right? Moving on from that, now we're in this, let's call it new normal. What's the, from my point of view, I'm looking at the revenue opportunity. So I think the flexibility in location and working location, working style, really created a lot of flexibility in terms of style and thought. And I saw it. It was quite surprising at the time, and it constantly surprises me. But basically, forcing people to engage outside their normal working environment, their normal small group of individuals that they would go to and sit next to on a day-to-day basis, has led to very kind of tangible new ideas, right? So in my job, so I effectively, a big part of my job is run an investment fund. And obviously with that, we're always kind of looking for new ideas, new things to invest in, to make money out of. And the new thoughts that came out of that was, it was interesting, right? You'd literally have people call you and say, oh, look, I was talking to this person who they would never have talked to unless they were kind of doing that Zoom in a coffee shop that day, et cetera, et cetera. And we bred, 8 to 10 new ideas in the first 6 months of the pandemic. And that would normally be 1 or 2 new ideas when we were sitting in an office. I mean, my best trader worked completely from home and continued that when given the opportunity, because the flexibility gave him that free thinking, and we saw that come through in ideas management. So, and with the technology working, look, it didn't work from day one. We struggled, but within it, it worked soon after day one. The ideas that came from this flexibility were very, very, very tangible. So I would say it's very much now shift away from cost management, because that's already a win, right? Every bank, Moko, you just mentioned, banks in Singapore and in terms of space management and things like that. That's all done. That's all banked, right? The cost guys are very happy. Now we're moving on to the revenue story. So I do think that's the story going forward. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I kind of remember the transition to open plan offices, probably a decade ago in the financial industry, where we kind of took down the walls of the offices and then moved to cubicles, and this is kind of an iteration on that. The other thing that strikes me is that trader who's at home needs a low latency connection, so he can buy the gaming internet connection, and his wife won't complain because he's using it for trading.
Absolutely.
Rohan, I want to come back to you. We lost you, which the irony of you being the group technology advisor and losing the technology is not lost on the rest of us, but welcome back. I mean, maybe you can go back and speak to those technology needs. And then, maybe following on from that, talk a little bit more in the same lines of what Felix was talking about. I mean, how have you seen, my background is CIO many years ago, and we were this was before FinTech and everything, and we were seen completely as a cost center. But, how has technology enabled that revenue discussion, especially in this hybrid period? So first, talk about the role of technology, and then similarly, kind of what we can expect on the revenue side.
Yeah, sure. So I think on the technology, as I said, we were not prepared. So we had to scramble, to provide our staff with laptops, VPNs, meeting facilities, online meeting facilities, Zoom, Teams. And as I said, the traditional BCM pandemic strategy did not work. Going to split sites, it just didn't work. So we learned that actually work from home was even much more effective, right? Because even if you split at 2 sites and somebody got sick, you'd lose half your workforce. It was much more effective to have people work from home. I think the follow-up question you had was around, what is the, what's the benefits, right? So obviously all this costs a lot of money, right? Providing about 80% of our staff with laptops and VPNs is extremely expensive. But of course, the first response was all about business continuity and resilience, right? I mean, we had to keep operating the bank, right? It's an essential service. But there were productivity gains, right? So I'll give you an example. A typical office commute is 1 hour in, 1 hour out, right? And on a typical 8-hour day, that's 25% productivity uplift, right? And we saw that from our employees, right? A lot of our employees were using the time to save to do work. Beyond that, we've learned that mobility, provides a lot of benefits, in terms of where you can work, when you want to work and how you want to work, right? So I'll give you an example. In the past, many of our functions, the customer would need to come to the bank. But now that we've equipped our staff with laptops and VPNs, they go out and meet customers, right? Especially our salespeople. And that's a big paradigm shift, right? In terms of service and productivity. The other thing I could highlight is, we learned how to work remotely to deliver IT systems, and it opened up, talent from across the globe. So at one point during the pandemic, we had people working in India, in Philippines, in Vietnam. So it also, taught us a new way of working.
Mm-hmm. Those are really good points. Mukul, I want to come back to you, and on the same topic, I think, Rohan and Felix both touched on kind of what they experienced from an operational technology perspective, as well as some of the advantages from that. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about what you're seeing in other industries that, ways that other companies outside of the financial services space have taken advantage of this, particularly on the revenue side of things, to really kind of, as Felix pointed out, come up with new ideas or optimize processes.
Yeah, no. So you see, there are a couple of things that you look at across the industry, and I think everybody, and depending upon where you were in the curve, everybody went through the curve of basically empowering the workspace or the workforce to work from anywhere, right? Rohan mentioned the fact that now people are not just working from home, but they're actually working cross-border. Many of them has gone back. Many of them probably recruited in that way on projects. Now, most of the time, all the industries across that we work with has gone through some transition. Now, it's very different in different settings, because if you're talking to a manufacturing organization, that's a very physical environment. And the challenges that they were having to keep up the productivity and getting people back in the manufacturing space was very different than when you see things in a bank. So as I said, right, banking industry did manage it fairly well, also because the nature of it is that they were able to do that distributed work. But some of the industries took a longer time to come back. It took a little bit more toll. And if you look at, as I said, manufacturing, I think it also when we look at companies, where were they located? I mean, the physical locations for their manufacturings or for their services also had a different. I think it's a very complex. It's just not by industry, Zenon, but it also within the industry, what's your configurations are. So it was so unique that it is still very hard to generalize. Everyone had maybe 60-70% common problems that everybody was facing, but that 20-30 were very, very unique. Within the banks, if you look at it also, it's a very unique problem for which part of the bank you are. And you mentioned Europe versus Asia, where you are. So, but all of them, one thing was common, all of them needed a very different way how they are being serviced, how they are being supported, and transition to this hybrid mode. The pace of the change might be a little different. Some did quite quick in this. Probably the day 2 was better or day 3 was better. Some took a little longer, and some was almost from. I mean, we ourselves, we do IT outsourcing. We run a service desk. A service desk by nature is a campus-based support. Yeah, you get a people in a common location. Rohan said we had a BCP plan, we had a call site, and none of that actually worked. You couldn't get people. There was a high risk of having people. Well, we had infrastructure in place that we could get people quickly on the calls using the IP phones from there. We had VPN, so we scramble. We work with our customers to ensure where there's a need to get them on board and approvals, because you're now changing locations. So, depending upon the industry we were quite fast, but it went through a lot of toll still on people, on how do you manage it? Because when you walk on a floor, you can look at productivity of agent. There's a dashboard. The guy who managing the team is looking at who is struggling. He goes to the guy, look at the tickets. It was very physical based support in the back, the way, and that needed to go digital. That needed to go through that transition phase of learning and people getting used to it, and to get to that productivity place. So I think all of us all of the industries are going through a very unique set of challenges, and the industry players are going through a very unique set of challenges. And I think it's also the same when things are bouncing back, when we are moving back to equilibrium from one side. Now you're moving to other side where we're trying to find the right balance. And that balance is also very different in terms of who you are and how do you service your customer, where your customers are, and where your workforce is based. So
those are really good points. I think the idea of finding that balance is really important. Rohan, I want to come back to you and kind of building on that. We talked about what we've done so far. I want to start kind of looking a little bit more into the future, but more specifically right now, I mean, what do banks need to be thinking about right now? Arguably, the pandemic, as you pointed out, was very difficult for even the disaster recovery procedures that were in place. And I remember, we covered earthquakes and electricity outages and everything else in our disaster recovery plan, but I can't remember pandemics being on there. But what do organizations, financial institutions need to be doing today to prepare for the future? I mean, what needs to be part of their agenda and strategy now?
Yeah, good question, Azan. I think two things. Obviously, first picking up on that resiliency topic. I think clearly, I think the entire financial industry needs to rethink, the resiliency strategy, the BCP moving forward. There's a lot of work going on, and I think the regulators are also, on it right now. But I think the other thing that happened, and this is more from our customers' perspective, they had to shift to digital, right? And there was because at one point we had to close all our branches, right? Pretty much all our branches. And the only way that they could get access to financial services was digital. So I think, the financial services industry needs to continue with that digitalization strategy. And, we found, even though we thought we were good, we were not that good, actually. Yes, our customers could get onto mobile, they could do their transactions. But, simple things like getting a document signed, a legal agreement, we still needed a wet signature, right? So there's opportunities around digital signatures. We found, for example, in our credit operations, a lot of it was still files, right? So we really need to digitize a lot of our documents. Virtual meetings with customers. During the pandemic, yes, we were forced to do it. But, some have gone back to physical meetings. But we found that the productivity improvement, for example, to do a site visit remotely is immense, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue on the digitization externally with our customers. And internally, I think, obviously, looking for models that can maximize productivity for the staff and also offer them, the flexibility that they want.
Mm-hmm. Those are good points. I just want to follow up on one point there, Rohan. I mean, when you talk about the need for wet signatures, I mean, that's always something that's struck me. We have a couple of suppliers that, we essentially have to sign PDFs and send it back to them, and they're not using DocuSign. And so there's a couple of challenges here. One is the technology itself that the organization has, but then there's also the regulatory, the regulations around that. And KYC in particular, I mean, here in Singapore, we have MyInfo and SingPass, which work very well from the KYC perspective. Do you see, regulations still, how has the pandemic impacted the government and the regulators' approach to digitizing some of these traditionally physical hard copy processes? What have you noticed in for the bank and Malaysia, perhaps?
Yeah, no, it's definitely accelerated that process. I remember, when the pandemic first hit, there was an exposure draft for eKYC in Malaysia, and all the banks pushed the regulator to publish that quickly and get that going. So I think the regulators are moving, and I think that's a good sign. I think the technology is there. It's probably just now getting the regulation in place and the adoption in place as well.
Yeah, oftentimes technology isn't the roadblock, but some of the processes around that. Mukul, I want to come back to you. I mean, obviously, Jetronics works with a lot of organizations, banks, and otherwise. Where are you seeing the engagement from banks right now? I mean, what are the new projects, and how do they relate to this new working environment? Just to get a feel for kind of what some of the priorities on the technology and the operations side are for these financial institutions.
Yeah, no, I think there are a couple of quite visible areas that first thing was obviously there was the whole shift of the services, right? I mean, the way we are used to service, and I gave an example of internal operation, but also you imagine, right? I mean, Rowan mentioned about changing people's devices from desktops to laptops to enable, I mean, a very small thing, right? But look about that change. It's just not about the change. It was very easy to do that change if you're working in office, but now the number of sites where you have to do this work is very different, right? Because you now have to you have to figure out a way of sending this stuff to individuals' house and make sure it works. And if it doesn't work, then you have to make sure that it gets serviced there. So your service point increase. So that whole transition in this and the way we were delivering services, that definitely was a big change. And the banks were asking for how can we help them, given that this needs to be done rapid. The pace of the change has to be done rapid. Now, if you now look at, so this was the immediate, right? When you are in it, and this is still continue to be there, and the changes are happening, and because there's a continuation phase of now making sure that whatever organization it is now prepared for hybrid moving forward. Yeah. Now, the second part is what was the mid and the long term. There were 2 or 3 key areas I mentioned about. A lot of conversation around facilities that came in, and the banks who were looking at the facilities and how to make them more smarter. And it's not about smarter just by putting few techs like lights and all, but actually making it smarter to enable the hybrid working. When you get to the office, how easy you can make people to get a place to work. Spaces have shrunk in general. And the fact is that there will be a workforce always will be working from home in a long-term view. But how do you then make it easier for people to book a place, make sure that they have services made available, and how can you do that digitally? So when you are there in the office, you make most out of that time. So things like that, access control. I mean, at some point of time, you were hiring employees on Zoom, interviewing people and hiring people on Zoom. But you couldn't send them an access card to the office. And actually, in today's world, you don't need an access card, right? I mean, you have changed their access control systems not to need an access card. It's probably a mobile phone or a QR on a mobile or an app that's sitting on a phone that give you access. But those things are getting embedded in. And there are a lot of conversation that we are going through of as the renovation conversations are happening. How do we make these places smarter and more adopted for collaboration than for the hybrid workspace? I think the third, which is a very common and going conversation, is about the cybersecurity, safety. Some of these changes had to happen, and they had to happen very quick because there was a squeeze of time and people need to act. But I think the reflection is now, again, going back, and a lot of conversations are happening in terms of how do we make sure that because if this is going to be, and this will be going to be the future, how do we make sure that we have all the precautions and safeties in place, and especially from cyber. And it's a lot of demand for those services we are seeing, and a lot of conversation with the customer we are seeing. We want to baseline. There were impacts, during the pandemic where we saw some cases where we saw some big cyber attacks. happening. And I think it was also always at the back of the mind, right? That you just want to make sure that with these change, that thing is not look behind. So those are a couple of areas of common conversation that happens. Change of the service, the way we are delivering services, how do we enable a workforce quickly and continue to get the services done in the way it's done, but also moving into smarter places, smarter offices. And the lastly is, talk on about cybersecurity. How do we ensure that our security baselines are right with this changing workforce?
That's great. Thanks, Mukul. If Felix, just continuing on from that, I mean, Mukul has kind of laid out what some of the activities or some of the products or services that are available in the market are. I mean, you as a practitioner, I mean, what's missing? What do you wish you had today that would make life easier, make your business able to perform better? Is there something that you can point to in terms of either technology or operations that would make things easier for you going forward?
Yeah, I mean, again, a great question, and I'd love the panel to tell me the answer to this question. So for me, the flexibility that has come with hybrid working has naturally reduced the face-to-face time, right? So if I think about the manifestation of that, the coaching, the developing of people in a virtual model, especially for some of the less experienced junior individuals that are coming into the organization, that's challenging, right? There is a natural tendency to embrace the hybrid model, and that may involve coming into the office from time to time, may not at all, and may not be an option for some individuals. So I'm not kind of dreaming of some metaverse, but a training coaching tool which can act in it like a face-to-face capacity, where people can come together in better tech than kind of sending messages to each other. I think is something we really need to work toward, because I think that's a permanent ask, right? I don't know what it is. I'm at probably the low end of IT capability in terms of spectrum, but I do think it is it's something we need to think carefully about as we build our future people, and we don't want them to be pigeonholed into roles or to jobs because they're learning things one by one, right? I do believe being in a wider forum and absorbing information by listening conversations, that water cooler moment that we talked about earlier, is a valuable part of the learning experience. So for me, now where we did all the basic tech, we've all got the laptops. We had a terrible experience trying to get laptops to our employees, but we got there. Now it's the next stage. How do we get full-time collaboration in a virtual space? And I think something in the tech environment will step up there and become a real thing. I just don't know what it is yet. That for me, that's the biggest deal.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. Excuse me. I hadn't thought about if you look at this whole Web 3.0 virtual worlds, that had developed kind of in parallel to everything that's happened within the pandemic. It's kind of ironic that it's happening at the same time, because maybe the tool is there. Rohan, let me come to you. I mean, specifically, maybe focus on a couple of technologies that excite you about enabling this future of work. Is there anything? One of the things that comes to mind for me is ChatGPT. That if yourselves or the attendees today haven't played around with, it's really remarkable technology. But Rohan, I mean, what are some of the things that excite you or that you feel will be important technologies going forward in the future?
Sure. Obviously, firstly, I think hybrid work is here to stay. I think that's the basic fundamental, right? I think there's going to be people working at home. It's going to be people back at the office, and really getting and fine tuning that is the immediate priority. I do think over time, with the shift to cloud, there's going to be more requirements around security and the whole desktop environment environment will shift towards multiple cloud providers. And so that will be definitely one of those trends that's happening. And I think that will accelerate because there are more and more SaaS providers out there, and the tradition.
Again?
I think we lost. Yeah, we got broadcast this time.
Yeah, sorry. That the traditional way of providing IT services is not going to be there, so it's going to shift. I think the final thing is obviously the metaverse, right? Obviously, everybody's excited about what's going to happen there. And even banks are starting to look at the opportunities around metaverse. I think banks are slightly slower, but there are use cases, and we'll see how that progresses.
Yeah, I think the metaverse example is really interesting. Certainly, a lot of the banks that we engage with have initiated efforts in the metaverse around that. I was a bit disappointed. I went into one of the banks in the metaverse, and I still had to queue for 3 hours before I could talk to somebody. So they're really carrying the experience directly over to the virtual space as well. Mukul, I want to come back to you and just for a second around risks. I mean, you talked about cybersecurity a little bit. What are the other key risks of this, this future hybrid world? I mean, some of this is just hygiene at this point in terms of disaster recovery, adoption, or adaptation, and again around cybersecurity. But what are some of the other risks that banks may be ignoring right now that really, or may not know about right now, that really they need to focus on as we go forward?
Yeah, thanks that you brought that up, because that is an often conversation that either happened very well in advance, or it just got ignored, and then you realize it just takes away the plan on a curve, which is either slowing it down or making it challenging. But before I come to that, Zenon, I want to go back to what Felix said about, because I was sort of excited and I was about to jump in, but then I said I'll just wait before it comes. On the areas of the technologies, right? And then Rowan sort of extended that on, and that's interesting he said, because that's an area which I'm very interested in. So there are 2 or 3 things that I am seeing, and I think there's so much of tech. I mean, with the blockchains and Web 3.0 you mentioned, but there are certain things which are coming. I mean, ChatGPT, I think in overnight it changed the way we think about AI. It just gave that acceleration to what AI can actually do, and you can have a lot more tangible feel for it so far, because so far you heard about it, read about it. Yes, it's coming in. Probably in some implementation you see some impact, but ChatGPT made it real. And I think there are certain technologies that are just there or in that curve. One of the thing is absolutely in the learning space that Felix mentioned, and especially with the newcomers joining and stuff like that, it's the experience of learning is far different than you can have somebody sitting with you 8 hours a day and follow you and see how you work. And one of the areas is the how communication systems are changing into more of a VR-based learning, where either you sort of use as avatars or but there has been a phenomenal development of those platforms, and the experience and the quality that you're getting in, whether it's a classroom settings, whether it's a board meetings. I mean, they are getting to a point where you really start enjoying it, because you get that feel which you don't get it usually on even a high definition 4K video conferencing. Right, you can see people around, and you can feel things around and stuff. We actually did a test. I mean, we run a pilot where we, in our field services, we have engineers, and they go and touch stuff in data centers, but they don't have all the skills for all the equipments. So you have a tech sitting remotely, and in pandemic you couldn't ship these people, right? They actually use the lenses, VR lenses, on which whatever the person is seeing, the remote tech engineer can have a look at it, and he's guiding every single movement in hand. You can throw the PDF to show the designs right now. So remotely the information has been, and he is still working. And those technologies were phenomenal, because it just amplified the field force capability. And we did a pilot and it worked really well. And I think this is just a start, because those technologies are gonna make people learning come way more faster, even in the setup where they're not together. So that's to some. I just wanted to put some dots there on the Felix point about that. And second thing, I think what is helping is how sure we are that all of this tech that has been invested in is actually how it is being consumed, or how well it is consumed. What's the behavior of your user around consumption of it? Now, that's a complex area of analytics, right? But with the platforms that, as you move to the cloud, which Rohan mentioned, right, you have now a lot more ability and a lot more options available to look at some of these things. I mean, one thing was you could do it traditionally by surveys, and those surveys usually probably don't give you their point in time. They age very fast, and things are moving faster. So those analytics that you get today is more on how people are getting used to this technology, how often they are using, what is the consumption level, are you seeing what sort of trend? They are helping banks to do two things. Are these investments going in the right direction, or what can be done? So it's a lot more focus on customer success. How do we make sure people are actually using it for things that it's rightfully to move in the right direction? Coming back now, sorry, Zenon, to your original question, which was on the security. Now, look, all of this thing is taking massive changes in the way we are working. Many of these areas are going to be very new for the organization, and even for that matter, you could more or less say you are on the cutting edge side of the technology, right? With it, it definitely brings all sort of paradigm about the security concerns around this, regulatory compliances around this, reporting around this. And these changes are going to be real. I mean, and it's, as I said, it's very different in Malaysia and Singapore. You see Malaysia is going, we're seeing going a lot more conversation of moving into a cloud, while Singapore, you see that was a work done by most of the organizations, and they're using cloud in an integrated way. But you see the adoption in different way. Needs are very different. But having said that, it's that by design, when you do these things, security is an elementary part of it. It is not like you do things and then you bring security later on to see, hey, everything is all right or not. So by design, getting into security, working very closely with security team. Also, the mindset within security team is more business focused, that they are not just the gateway of stopping things, but more about how do they help in the design process to build things secure. So when they get out, when they get into the production, they get into implementations, you can manage the risks. It's all about managing the risk at that point of time. And you are managing it. It's not left there to be discovered. And that's the difference between what I say is the organization that are doing it more in a secured approach way versus sometime when you just discover a oops moment, which you never want to be in that situation. Yeah.
Those are really good points. I mean, increasingly, this is the new normal of what needs to be baked into any solution that's there, or any process for that matter. It's amazing. I mean, we're already going on 50 minutes here, so getting towards the end of the discussion, but I want to spend a few minutes towards the end here looking at the future. Felix, let me come to you. Looking in your crystal ball and beyond whenever the next pandemic is coming, please tell us if you know that. But beyond that, I mean, how do you see the needs of the workplace changing in the future? I mean, we know where we are today in this hybrid space where people are looking for different things. What are some of the things that you envision happening in the future, and the changes that in the demands, going back to, I mean, your customers to a certain extent, some of which are your staff? How do you see their needs changing in the future?
Well, yeah, great question. Thank you. I mean, I think we're going to stop talking about this new normal pretty soon. It's just normal, right? So we're not going backwards, right? This is this road we've been on for, an intense 3 years, but it had started before the pandemic, is going to continue. What I see as the future, I certainly think while a physical workspace will exist, a place where customers will want to meet the provider will continue. I do think the continuation into a virtual capacity will continue. We talked earlier about regulators and governments. They are going to adapt. And they're going to adapt fast. It's not in their nature. Laws and regulations take a long time to write and tend to be around a long time. We're still using banking regulations from the 1970s. But that is going to the adaptation of the rules around in which we operate will continue and become, and change fast. I do think what we do need to consider is heavily is what's going to happen with the customer, what's going to happen with the employee. We're going into a demographic world where there's just not going to be that many people, at a working age relatively soon, right? Now, indeed, the working life is going to change. People may work longer, but they're going to work differently, and they're going to work from all over the place, right? The finance industry, because we don't manufacture things, because we sit in, as a kind of broker between, and provider of financial services, means that we can pull, staff and customers from, all over the place without really needing a physical experience. So I think that's the key. We're going to have to adapt the model as an employer, as a provider of services to customers, to basically be permanently flexible. So for me, that's the key, and it's challenging, but the mindset I think it's already changed. The grey hairs like myself, to reiterate that point, are changing. I was quite proud of myself one day. I got sent the laptop, and with a set of instructions and a chat on the telephone, I actually put it in myself, right? And if I can do it, certainly, our more flexible customers, our clients, our staff, are really just going to love this new model, and it's going to continue to grow. So for me, it's a much needed and probably much overdue, but very bright future in terms of next steps.
That's great, Felix. Rohan, would you agree with everything Felix said? Is that the future that you see?
Yeah, I think it's going to be shaped by how our customers and employees evolve and their needs. I'll give you a good example. We have just won one of the 5 digital banks, and the way the digital banks will operate will be very different, right? We have 14,000 staff in RHB. This digital bank will be a bank that services 2 million customers with 500 staff, right? It will be, we won't have branches, right? So that branch workplace will just go away, right? 40% of the workforce will be tech, right? So the employee mix will also change, right? We won't have a call center. We'll just have chatbots, right? So I think we are going to accelerate into the virtual world. We talked about metaverse. The banks are already looking at that. And I think, what Mukul highlighted is also going to be true. The way we train people may eventually be on the metaverse, right? The way we provide experiential, services may be on the metaverse in the future. So I think we're down this road, and I think that evolution will continue to evolve.
That's great. Thanks, Rohan. Mukul, coming to you. I mean, does Getronics already have a metaverse offering? Is this the future?
Well, yes, we are getting into that. We are seeing a lot more increased requirements coming in that space. As I said, I mean, we work with the industry from the tech side as well as with our customers. And when you come to a work of a support and services organization, our main goal is to make sure that when the demand is picking up, you do have the right solution. And then more importantly, those solutions are adapted and serviced well, and customers are able to use it, right? Because there is always the curve of adoption. I think one thing which I also picked up, and I say, we are talking about, and Rohan mentioned, right, this whole move within the industries of moving from physical to digital bank, and you will look at a very different demand coming from these. I think it's also bringing a debate more often, what exactly is the workspace definition is now. It used to be very simple. It was the desk with the phone and with a laptop or a computer, and that was your workspace. But that definition is now outdated long back. And the new definition is I would say it is not being defined that well yet because it is transforming, but it is definitely way bigger than that. It is the place where you can find a place to work and you have access to everything. So the experience of you getting there as a trader floor with 7 screens on in front of you, and you can do a low latency trading. You actually want the same at home, and then you probably want probably a mini version of it if you're on the travel, with the same security, with the same experience, and all the other services that you need with it, right? And that changing definition is gonna change and impact the way we do business, the way we will engage customers, and way we continue to be productive in those settings. It has an immense power behind it because it, as I think Felix mentioned and Rowan added on, you have now bigger access to talent pool. You're not limited by physical locations. So I believe the future pretty much lies is how well we adopt it and how we implement it and how we make most out of this opportunity that lies ahead of us, many of us who are already just going through this journey right now.
That's a great, positive, and exciting note to end on. Thank you, Mukul. Thank you so much for this discussion on that. And this hour has really flown by in everything that we've gone through. So Mukul, Felix, Rohan, thank you so much for your contribution. And thank you, the attendees, for attending today. We have a number of questions in the background. We've answered some of those throughout the discussion, but there are others that we'll reply back to you over email. We've also recorded this discussion, so we will make the recording available and we'll share that with all of the registrants over the next few days. Thank you again to Getronics for helping us out with this webinar on envisioning the future of the workplace in Asia's financial industry. Fantastic discussion, really looking forward to continuing it. And thank you, everyone. This concludes today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.